All right, we're gonna get started. Carly, would you mind kicking us off?
Yes, thank you so much. Welcome to today's workshop. Our topic tonight is managing guilt in pregnancy and postpartum. I'm Carly. I'm a nurse midwife and the education lead here at 7 Starling. This is a place where people can get support through pregnancy and postpartum. I know it's really common to feel overwhelmed in your pregnancy and in the newborn stage. And we guide people every step of the way from the comfort of your own home. Meet every other week with a doula virtually and small groups covering all topics in pregnancy, like pregnancy symptoms, childbirth education, newborn care, weaning, feeding, and all the stuff in between that comes up. At the end of the event, we'll talk a little bit about how you can join. But for now, let's go ahead and get started. So for our agenda tonight, we are going to start with overviewing what is guilt, why it's so common in this transition from pregnancy through parenthood, as well as useful techniques on how to overcome guilt. We're going to have time for questions and answers at the end, but you can always pop them into the chat as well. So here with me tonight, I have Paige Bellenbaum. She is a licensed a licensed therapist with a master's in social work from Columbia University. She's also the founding director of the Motherhood Center, which specializes in treatment of postpartum depression and anxiety disorders. Welcome, Paige. How you doing?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, Carly. Really excited for this event and for being a part of 7 Starling.
Oh, well, thank you so much. We're really happy to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience helping people, as well as just sort of why this event is important to you?
Absolutely. And I apologize to our listeners of all times for my dogs to decide that they want to play in the background. It's right now. So again, really happy to be here. My name is Paige Bellenbaum, and I have experience and background in treating women with perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, otherwise known as postpartum depression. I came into this work because after my son was born 15 years ago, if you can believe it, I have a teenager now. I never thought that was going to be possible, but it is. I had severe postpartum depression and anxiety. And ever since I had that experience, it became a lifelong goal of mine and very, very popular to ensure that other new and expecting mothers that are experiencing perinatal mood and anxiety disorders get the support and clinical care that they need and deserve to feel better.
That's so great. Such important work that you do. I mean, as a midwife, I see these issues come up so frequently, and in our groups at 7 Starling, it's so often not discussed outside of these small groups, and people don't feel like they have necessarily access to the resources they need. So I'm so happy that you're doing this work.
Thank you. It is a gift to do this work. You know, what a lot of people don't know about postpartum depression and anxiety is that it's incredibly treatable. So many women do not seek treatment because there's such an enormous amount of shame and stigma and guilt, which is our topic of conversation today, that surrounds it. And so, you know, my job is to ensure that people know how common it is to experience these things, and are able to reach out for help and get the care they need and deserve.
Oh, well, thank you again for being here. So I just want to kick it off to the audience. If people don't mind dropping into the chat, you know, the topic is guilt. And so we're thinking about anything that has come up for you that has, you know, made you feel guilty over the last few weeks or in your journey as a pregnant or postpartum person. Yeah, just go ahead and share with us some of the things that have been making you feel guilty. Okay, I'm seeing eating ice cream, being inefficient at work. A couple people talk about breastfeeding formula, not wanting to feed my baby. Okay, hating my mother-in-law even though I need her. Absolutely. Not having enough time to learn about pregnancy and birth. So these, you know, drinking coffee while pregnant, working too hard, guilt on my body, self-care, letting my baby cry it out. So these are, it's interesting. We're seeing both in the question and answer box as well as in our chat a bunch of things coming through. Paige, these for me all ring a bell and resonate as what people bring up in our groups and in patient care. So I'm assuming that you hear about a bunch of these things too.
Absolutely. Yeah, guilt comes up all the time in new parenthood, especially for new mothers. There's such a sense of shoulds. I should be doing it this way. I'm supposed to be doing it this way. And so much guilt that surrounds every move we make, every step we take as new and expecting mothers. And this guilt, can serve as a really large obstacle to us connecting with all of the things that we could potentially strive to enjoy in the pregnancy and postpartum period. There's so many things that impact the guilt that we experience sometimes on a daily basis. Just considering social media that sends this very strong message of perfectionism in motherhood, all the things that we should be doing to ensure that we're healthy throughout our pregnancy, eating the right things, doing the right things.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of things come up about, just decisions people are making in their pregnancy, like about eating, about exercising, about having an epidural, about, just a lot of, and I don't know, I want to first thank everyone for sharing. We're seeing a lot of things come in, and I think, what you're saying, Paige, really, it's so prevalent, right? Like the shoulding.
Yeah, absolutely. In the treatment that I do at the Motherhood Center and the women that I work with, I oftentimes will say the should word is like the F word. It's a terrible word. It's a bad word, because what it does is it invites self-judgment, right? When we hear the narrative of shoulds and supposed tos in our mind, it sets us up for a sense of failure and falling short.
Yeah. So I guess the question that I would have for you is what is guilt? Like, where does this come from? You mentioned sort of the should word and this pressure, but what is it actually?
So I think that guilt has always been there since the beginning and the dawning of time for new and expecting mothers. I think that guilt has become increasingly more intense over time. And a lot of that has to do with this very romanticized version that we all are kind of spoon-fed as it relates to pregnancy and postpartum. Many women enter the pregnancy phase thinking that it's going to feel blissful and amazing and the best thing that's ever happened to us, that we're going to love every moment of it. We then enter the postpartum phase and anticipate that we are going to have this immediate bond and connection with our baby and feel unconditional love, and that things are going to be wonderful. And in a lot of instances, these things are the case, but in more instances, these things can be difficult, and they can be a both and. There can be enjoyable moments of pregnancy and postpartum, and there can be some really, really, really hard parts. But what happens is that because we have this romanticized version and kind of glamorized version of motherhood all around us, when we experience those hard parts and the things that are less than blissful or perfect, then we start to get the sense and feel as though we're doing something wrong. We're making the wrong choices. We're doing the wrong things. We're choosing the wrong products. And so because of all of this, it is a breeding ground for guilt in the perinatal period. And we find ourselves in a situation where we're constantly comparing ourselves to others during pregnancy. Perhaps one woman is carrying a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, and that causes us to feel guilty about the way that we're appearing physically in our pregnancy. We might hear another woman who has been eating only organic homegrown vegetables, and we might feel as though maybe we're doing something wrong and we should be doing it the way that she is. What this all stems from is for an ultimate desire to do best by our baby, to be able to provide the best we can possibly give the baby while it's gestating inside of us, and the best we can possibly give to him or her when they join us in the postpartum period. And so because of all this real and perceived pressure, it's very understandable that women oftentimes find themselves feeling guilty and less than.
Well, what I think I heard you say, and I think it's such an interesting concept is that it's coming from a place of good intent, that it's coming from our desire to do well and to do right by ourselves and by our babies and by our families. But then it sounds like it's kind of like this dissonance between like this kind of perfectionist idea with like the reality of living where we, have to work and sometimes don't have time to make this like beautiful organic lunch, or sometimes we just want that, second or third cookie. So it's just, it's like that gap between like our expectations or hopes for ourselves. Does that sound about right?
I think that sounds great. And as a result, coming from a clinical background, there's actually psychological theory that's deeply rooted in the middle ground, which is good enough. And there's a famous psychologist, Winnicott, who coined this concept back in the 60s of good enough mothering. And I will spare you the nitty-gritty details, but the overarching emphasis of this theory is that if we are striving for perfection throughout pregnancy and postpartum and in the lifelong job of motherhood, we're actually doing our babies a disservice and our children a disservice because we're setting up a false sense of reality. If we do not allow our children to experience and tolerate distress and disappointment, if we do not show them the normalcy of mediocre, having emotions, not doing everything perfectly, we're actually setting them up more for success when they enter the world, because life is not a perfect place. And so the more we can expose them to what it is to be a human, the better suited they are to succeed.
That makes sense. I'm seeing a lot of people kind of commenting here about different ways that they feel that pressure to make things seem perfect, or to be perfect, or to be better. So yeah, it sounds like this is definitely a ubiquitous sensation or feeling experience for people.
Absolutely.
What an interesting idea, right? Is that we want to do so well by our children that we are, making ourselves feel worse. And if we are somehow successful in constructing this perfect world, we're actually not necessarily serving them to be the most resilient humans they could be.
Exactly.
So do you think this is coming up? You mentioned Instagram or social media, and I think about, is this something that's worsening, or is it just our perception? Is it something that you think this like pressure and feeling of guilt is getting more intense?
Absolutely. It's interesting, right? With social media in the public's eye, especially right now with what's going on in Congress. But social media has played a very large contributing role, especially for the population of new and expecting mothers, because women are trying to put their best face forward all the time. They're trying to get that perfect photo of the family standing on the grass during the holidays while everybody is dressed up in these beautiful holiday outfits. And it's that picture perfect, oh my goodness, right? And you see it and you're like, that family looks so happy. They look so perfect. Now, what that viewer doesn't know is that the 10 minutes leading up to that money shot, the husband and the wife were fighting. She was saying, I'm so mad at you, sleep on the sofa tonight, you're not doing anything. The baby perhaps spit up all over her beautiful dress, and the toddler was having a temper tantrum on the grass, right? Like, that is real motherhood, that is real parenthood. But when all we see around us are these picture perfect representations of how people are showing up on these different social media outlets, of course, that's what we compare ourselves to. We see that and we think, that person has it all figured out. She or they are doing it the right way. I don't look like that. That's not my experience at all. I'm failing, right? I'm not doing this right, which is why I so strongly encourage women, if those types of images are contributing to your guilt about yourself or your relationship to the baby or anything, it's okay to temporarily block those people. It's okay to not be on those platforms. Anything that's reinforcing that concept of perfection or making you feel bad about yourself, it's okay to step away from that and surround yourself with people who are showing the real images as they pertain to motherhood, the truths of motherhood, being on platforms and following entities that aren't afraid to show that motherhood is messy. So to answer your question, it's inevitable that when we see all this perfection, whether it's body or family or relationship to baby, it's going to make us think that that's the bar, when in fact it has nothing to do with the bar, that everybody is struggling in some way.
Yeah, that it's just so true, because even if like what you're saying to me, it's a great reminder. It's not like I've never considered the fact that people are just putting these images out, right? I know that, but me myself, I'm not on social media a ton, but I do, look, and I do look at my friends, and I do want to have a nice picture, right? And so it's interesting that even when you know that it's not true, there's still a weird desire to be part of it, or to have that photo, or to contribute in some way, which I guess can be kind of harmful.
Well, I want to, if it's okay, Carly, just share a personal experience that I had with you. As mentioned, I had severe postpartum depression and anxiety when my son was born, and it was in the middle of summer. It was very, very hot. I hadn't been out of the house in weeks. And I finally dragged myself out one day, convinced that my son and I needed some fresh air. We went to the park. I got there, and immediately I saw all these women that were like down on their hands and knees with their babies and toddlers, smiling, having a good time. And I was like, oh, I shouldn't have done this. Now, this was way before social media, so this was actually happening. But I was like, I shouldn't have come here. This just is a reinforcer of how I'm doing this wrong, because I'm not feeling this way towards my baby. I sat down on a park bench, and as I sat there, this woman I caught out of the corner of my eye, beautiful, like wearing a super cute outfit. Her hair's done. She has makeup on. She's beautiful, glowing, and she has this baby strapped to her in the carrier, and she's getting closer and closer to my bench. And I'm thinking to myself, please do not sit down next to me. Like, I cannot have a conversation with another person who has this all figured out. Like, I can't do it. And sure enough, she came and sat down. She took the baby out of the carrier. The baby's this beautiful girl with rosy cheeks, smiling at her. She's smiling at the baby. She looks over at me and sees that I'm wearing a sling and looking miserable, and says, "Isn't this the greatest thing that ever happened to you?" And I looked at her and I said, "No, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. And sometimes I wish I'd never done it." And her smile started to fade, and she started to cry. And she said, "Thank you so much for saying that. I feel the same way." And so I use the story as much as I possibly can as a
I have
tool.
chills. I have chills right now. It's like, oh my
I
gosh.
feel them. I do too. And this is my life, and I've told this story a million times. But you cannot judge a book by its cover. You cannot think for a moment that because somebody is appearing so perfect in front of you that they have it all figured out, because there's a really good chance that they're struggling too.
Paige, thank you so much for sharing that. I know it's, like you said, you've said it before, but it's so powerful to hear that, even though, it is something that you have been vulnerable about before. It means the world to know that that people can even walk up to you and say one thing and not be consistent 100% of the time. It's really important to keep in mind for everyone that you can have those highs and you can have those lows, and that somebody having a high doesn't mean that in 3 seconds with your openness, it can turn quickly. So I guess when I think about this, and in your work with people, is there a way to sort of combat this? So like, you chose that moment. I don't know if it was a conscious choice or if it just happened that it came out. Like, were you like, did you think ahead that you were going to say the truth, or was it just spontaneous?
It was totally spontaneous. I mean, I also just couldn't muster up. I'd been telling the lie for so long that I just couldn't, in that moment, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't pretend. I didn't have anything left to pretend other than just being honest about what I was feeling.
Oh, yeah, that's such an important moment to have. And I'm sure for her, that was so special to not be all of those things that you were projecting onto her, not in a negative way, but, your perception, maybe was something that she felt pressure to be all of the time.
Well, I think like we all can play a role in this. And I think sometimes it's kind of like, well, who's going to go first? But if we all challenged ourselves to break the cycle of putting forward our best self, and instead led with our honest self and our truthful self and experience in relationship to motherhood, then we would be able to create a movement of people who are being honest, right? And therefore, ultimately combating the pressure that leads to so much guilt. If we were talking about how, there's moments of this that I love, and there's moments of this that are the hardest thing I've ever done. There are times where I look at my body in a forgiving way, and there are times that I look at myself and I feel just repulsed in the postpartum period because I haven't lost my baby weight. Like, if we were having these real honest conversations, we would minimize the shoulds and supposed tos, because we would normalize the actual experience.
So somebody just wrote in here about that idea of not losing the baby weight and feeling like says, when I mention it to other people, they get awkward and that makes them feel worse. So when you talk about this idea of vulnerability, what do we do if you are having a moment and then it doesn't feel like the person reciprocated or doesn't make you feel better?
The other side of the conversation, and there also needs to be a national movement around how to respond to somebody else's painful or stressful experience or comment. I do a lot of work with couples, and so one of the things that we run into all the time is when a wife will say to her partner, a girlfriend will say to her partner, I'm feeling really bad about my body, or I'm feeling super anxious about the baby and I constantly am afraid that something is wrong with him or her. That so oftentimes that can be met with, oh, everything's fine, or you look great, right? And what ends up happening is we feel dismissed, we feel not taken seriously, and we feel also on top of it all, like maybe we're doing that thing wrong too, right? And so what I always like to encourage couples to respond, or partners to respond with, and this is an open invitation to the world, is instead of just coming up with that one-liner of this too shall pass, or you look great, or whatever it might be, is be interested, right? Join somebody where they're at. That sounds really uncomfortable or really distressing for you. Tell me a little bit more about it. What's it like? What has it been like for you, and all of the body changes that have gone on in the perinatal period, right? Let somebody tell you more about how they're feeling, instead of just telling them how they should be feeling. So I want to normalize that for everybody out here. The unsolicited advice you get, or the kind of sweep it under the rug comments that make you feel like you're not really listening to me.
That was even worse. I shouldn't have said anything almost. So I want to just pause for 1 second. And I know it looks like a couple questions have been coming in and a couple comments, and just invite the attendees, if you do have questions thus far, to drop them either into the question box or into the chat here, so that we can address them before moving too quickly. So this idea, somebody mentioned here, toxic positivity. So you had said earlier this, this unrealistic expectation, and thinking about, there are so many messages to people to do exactly what you say, like sleep it under the rug, tell people you look great, say I'm fierce, I can do anything, and just, assume that everything should be positive and fine, and that all that's missing is your positive outlook. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many messages out there, and there is this toxic positivity in so many places. And, interestingly enough, this isn't a direct response to that, but like it even comes at us from the medical community and from our treatment providers, right? Like one thing it makes me think of, and I've been talking a lot about this to women, is, you go to your 6-week checkup with your OB or midwife, and the two things that they usually say to you, or that we anticipate them saying, are that it's okay for you to exercise again and have sex. Now, for anybody who's been 6 weeks postpartum, you know damn well that the last thing you want to do is have exercise and particularly have sex, considering that everything that your body has gone through, whether you've had a C-section or a vaginal delivery, that is the furthest thing from your mind, right? But yet when we hear these things, we think that's what we should be doing. We're supposed to be doing, right? Because the doctor's telling us we can, well, then clearly that's for a reason, is because they're thinking or mentioning this to us because that's what we're supposed to do now. It's not a direct response to toxic positivity, but like, to your point, it's everywhere we look, right? Whether it has to do with social media or even baby products. Like, I remember another example of having diapers delivered at my door, and on a Pampers box, this beautiful, like amazingly gorgeous woman smiling at her baby on the box. I opened up the door and I closed the door because I could not tolerate looking at yet another perfect depiction or toxic positivity image of a woman. But yeah, I mean, I think all of these things, they all feed into that romanticized, glamorized motherhood that ends up leaving us feeling either a lot of the time, sometimes, or most of the time that we're falling short and guilty.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you again. I see, a lot of people are also, bringing up questions, and thank you guys all for your questions and for, opening up and sharing with us. Something that I've been seeing a lot here in the chat is asking about guilt around feeding, breastfeeding, weaning, pressure to do it longer, pressure to stop when I don't want to. Can you talk, is that something that you also see a lot? And, what do we do about all of this conversation is pressure, and everybody seems to have an opinion, right?
Every day, all the time. I would say breastfeeding is one of the #1 contributing factors to developing a perinatal mood and anxiety disorder, so postpartum depression or anxiety. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I might sound somewhat contradictory to many of you that are here with us tonight, but because I come from a clinical perspective, and there are often times where a woman who's really struggling from anxiety and or depression, who is exclusively breastfeeding or pumping and is on a rigorous schedule, and again, trying to do it right and feeling guilty because they think they're doing it wrong, we will write on a prescription pad, stop breastfeeding. We are very much so in the school of thought of feeding is best. We strongly endorse either formula feeding, pumping, breastfeeding, whatever you do is right for you. And yet we're in this chapter, in this phase of like, breastfeeding is the only way to go. And because that's the message we receive, even in pregnancy, we're willing to go to great lengths to do it the way that we think we should be doing it, right? And so for so many women, another thing that we're not told about in the perinatal or in the pregnancy period is, yes, breastfeeding is recommended. And here are some things you should know about breastfeeding, so if they happen to you, that you're not alarmed and you know what to do. Cracked nipples, mastitis, clogged ducts, oversupply, undersupply. These are the kinds of things that almost every woman experiences when she's acclimating to breastfeeding, but we don't know that these things are common. So when they happen to us, we become incredibly anxious. We feel as though our breasts are failing and they're doing something wrong. We feel guilty because our body isn't doing what it's supposed to do by, living up to this expectation of you have a baby and the milk flows. Well, that doesn't happen for everybody. In fact, it doesn't happen for a lot of people, but yet it's up against this pressure to breastfeed, breastfeed, breastfeed. And when I tell you, again, looking at this through a clinical lens, the amount of well-intentioned lactation consultants and breastfeeding specialists who they have their eye on what they do, which is ensuring that women's milk supply is strong, but will put them on these very rigorous pumping schedules where they're pumping every 2 hours and not
So you're
sleeping.
pumping every 2 hours, feeding every 3 hours, trying to sleep at some point during the day, trying to store the milk without spilling it, washing your pump parts. It's just completely unrealistic.
It's so much. And so what we, I give all of you permission that are listening right now, however you decide to feed is right for you. And that is what matters. Feeding feeding is the right way to go. And, you know, it's okay to give yourself permission to supplement or even to stop if it's that stressful.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that idea of like feeling that your body failed, right? And around breastfeeding, this comes up a lot. It also comes up around epidurals and C-sections, which, you know, as a midwife, I've seen so many people that there is perfectly clear medical indication to have an abdominal delivery, a surgical delivery, and they still are in tears afterwards and think like, what's wrong with me or what's wrong with my body? And it's really hard because you just see that there's no convincing them in one conversation. It's like this entire society has said there's one way to do things, and
Yeah.
somehow we're holding one way of being or one way of birthing or one way of feeding as like almost like a moral thing.
Right. Yeah. And when when we're not able to do it, or if it happens differently than we planned, then we feel guilty. We feel like we failed. We feel like we didn't deliver in the way that we are supposed to or we should be doing.
Yeah. And it's on both sides, right? Because like as I mentioned before, some people are hiding that they're still breastfeeding. Somebody said in here, I'm still breastfeeding my 2-year-old and I don't tell anyone. And another person, you know, doesn't want to have a C-section, but everybody's telling them to do it. So it's interesting how, you know, it's almost like there's this really narrow, like allowed path,
Mhm.
and everything else is sort of like pressure zone.
Yeah, I mean, it's breastfeeding and it's like a natural delivery without an epidural, right? And like how often well, first of all, for those of you who've given birth, and not necessarily a spoiler alert, but I offer this just to enter delivery with an open mind. If you haven't delivered yet, there's a lot of instances in where your birth plan comes to fruition. And there's also a lot of instances in where it doesn't completely or it is completely different than what you anticipated, right? And there's also a lot of guilt in that. We feel guilty that our body didn't deliver the way that it was supposed to, that our birth plan didn't go accordingly. I had a patient once, I love her so very much. She had a 10-page laminated birth plan that she handed out to everybody in the delivery room. And her delivery went nothing like what was in the 10-page laminated birth plan. And that was devastating to her. She spent so much time planning this out in a way exactly as she wanted it. And literally none of it went that way. And it was kind of the invitation to her to then start to feel guilty and anxious and depressed and all of those things. So, you know, as much as we can prepare women on the front end for the diversity of options and potential outcomes as they pertain to birth, pregnancy, breastfeeding, postpartum, the better job we're doing letting them know that it could be many things and it's okay if it's not just one thing.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's something that we try so much to impress upon people, that it's like you don't know what's going to happen, and be open. Like you can have preferences, but think about, you know, it's not only up to you, right? You have a baby in there and you have, you know, other things that could be going on with your body. But I totally hear that. I think it's so you mentioned a few things, and I want to definitely make sure we have a chance to really address like what is our solutions? Like what can we offer people tonight if they're in these moments? And there's a couple things that I heard you say, and one of them was sort of like that front end expectation setting. And I'd love to know, like, if you were talking to somebody here and like some of these questions, like what am I supposed to do with all this guilt? You know, you say all this and I still, you know, want this birth plan. What do I do?
I mean, look, we all have expectations. We all want things to go a certain way, and we're going to do what we can to ensure that outcome. So long as we balance that with the fact that I want this, I'm working hard to achieve this goal and to have this outcome that I really, really want. And I'm also preparing myself for the fact that it might not go exactly this way. You know, there is a concept in the work that we do at the Motherhood Center. It's deeply rooted in a theoretical modality called dialectical behavior therapy, DBT. And the concept dialectical behavioral therapy it is what it is, the dialectic, the both and so much of motherhood is the both and, right? And to give you an example, sometimes I look at my baby and think he's the cutest thing ever, and sometimes I feel like I can't wait to get away because it's so overwhelming. Sometimes I really love my partner because he can, like, you know, chip in and do stuff, and the other times I despise him because he's not doing nearly enough, right? Like, this is what it is to be a human being.
It's like nobody loves their baby more than when they're sleeping. They just look at them, they're like, oh, you're cute now.
Exactly. It's the both and because we don't learn a lot in life that it's okay to have not only just two emotions at the same time, but sometimes 3 or 4 or 5. You know, the same concept can apply to what we anticipate and our expectations, right? It can be both that we want this and that we are prepared for it potentially to go a different way.
Absolutely. So here's a question that I have in the chat. And it says, is it other people who make us feel guilty? You mentioned social media, unsolicited advice, or are we making ourselves feel guilty? And kind of how do we deal with it if it's us, and how do we deal with it if it's somebody else?
So I think it's actually almost easier to deal with what's coming at us. I think the real work is the narrative we tell ourselves. It's such a great point, right? Our own worst critic, the person who judges us more than anyone else, is ourselves. And so I will oftentimes encourage women, keep an eye on the shoulds. Notice how frequently they're coming up in your pregnancy and your postpartum period. How often are you feeling like you're doing something wrong or that you should be doing it a different way, right? It's important to notice how frequently that's happening. And then what I want you to do in that moment is ask yourself, according to who, right? Because I think so much it's the perceived pressure and the self-expectation that really contributes to that guilt and shame. But when we ask ourselves, according to who? Who's telling me that it should be that way? Who is it a higher power? Like, is there really anybody telling me that? Or am I deciding on my own that that's how it should be? And then to take it one step further, you know, to introduce a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy in here, when we're having a negative thought like that, we can come up with subsequent thoughts to replace it, right? But we really have to practice this over and over. We can't just do it once and expect it to stick. So what I like to encourage women to do is come up with some mantras for yourself. Some examples are, I'm doing the best I can. Nobody taught me how to do any of this. I'm learning as I go along. Whatever it is that you can tell yourself in that should moment and replace it. I will oftentimes say, write it in big letters and put it on your refrigerator, right? Carry it in a piece of paper, or like put it on a sticky on your chest. So anytime it's there, you can look at it and you can read that to yourself. Read it before you go to bed every night. Because
set it as like your screensaver on your phone.
Absolutely.
Like as your phone falls asleep, it's like flashes at you.
Absolutely.
I love that.
These are things we can do to really pay attention to where that judgment is coming from and how we can replace it with a more helpful thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting though, because when you think about that idea of where it comes from, even our trusted sources, right? So I'm saying this, taking responsibility as well as a midwife who has worked with a lot of people prenatally, postpartum. You know, you do have these recommendations that you give people. And I myself had a baby and part of this, you know, pandemic baby tribe. And I remember leaving the hospital and thinking there are so many rules. Like, I can't have my baby sleep here. I can't have them sleep in this position. I have to wrap them in this way. I have to wake them if they've slept too long, and I have to put them down if they've been awake too long. And I have to like take a shower every day, which my postpartum nurse said to me was like, promise me you'll shower every day. And I was like, of course I'm going to shower. But then I was like, I'm not promising you anything. You know, it was just like there was, even from the medical community and the people who you trust that are really well intentioned, it felt like there was so many rules to navigate.
There's a ton of rules to navigate. And on top of that, not only are we hearing those rules from people around us and oftentimes providers, but we're also in a sea of conflicting opinions on how to make these things happen, right? So I am clearly much older than your audience. When I was a baby, there was one book on the market for baby sleep, infant sleep, and it was called Dr. Spock's Infant Sleep Book, which is a creepy name for a book, period. It was the only infant sleep book on the market. Every single mother was using this book to sleep train their child. And if I were to tell you what that looked like, people would probably be flabbergasted. But we now, fast forward, live in a society where there's like 700 books on how to get your infant to sleep, or, you know, multiple conflicting opinions about feeding methods and the best pump to buy. And like, women are in this position, new mothers, of like constantly having to make decisions. And it's impossible because there's so many decisions to make. So when you couple that with the insight and advice that we're getting, depending on the discipline, whether it's the lactation consultant who's telling you to pump every 2 hours and then feed for an hour after that, or that I was just speaking to a woman in a group today who brought her baby to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician said to her, "Are you doing tummy time with the baby?" And she was like, "I don't know what tummy time is. Like, nobody told me about tummy time." And the pediatrician was like, "You should have been doing that for the past 2 months. You must be doing 30 minutes of tummy time a day." And she was like, went into a panic, right? Of like, have I destroyed my child's chances of being successful because I didn't make him do 30 minutes of tummy time a day? It's like, you know, all of these things that new moms have to navigate. It's such a sea of decision making and wanting to do what's best for our baby, but yet, how do I know it's best? And then feeling bad if one discipline is telling us that we have to do it this way and we're not.
And hard to just know, like, how important is this, right? Like, you come in with your 15 rules and it's like, but if I have to do the vitamin D drops and the tummy time and this, like, what if I only did one of them? Which is there like a priority list somewhere where you can tell me which one of these is like the most necessary?
I mean, that's a great question, right? Is like, and you know, I know that in the haze of being sleep deprived and second guessing oneself and feeling like we don't know what we're doing, but I do encourage you in those moments of question or overwhelm to, again, it's an opportunity for us to be honest and tell our truth. There are so many things, provider, that I'm navigating right now as a new parent. I'm hearing this, I'm hearing that. I'm having a hard time knowing what I should actually do and not do. As a sleep deprived mother who's trying to figure this out, can you let me know what I absolutely should be doing?
Yeah, give me two or give me three
yeah,
rules.
exactly. Or can you just give me 2 today and maybe another one when I come back, you know, a month from now? You know, I think providers oftentimes feel like they're in a position where they have to like give it to you all because it's medically recommended. But it's also like, you know, when we look at the growth chart, right? And as parents, it's like one of our obsessions, right? Like, my baby is X percentile in height and weight. But the reason why we have that is because there's a benchmark. But just because somebody is at like 6% height and weight on this benchmark that we have because we need to have one, doesn't necessarily mean that that baby isn't going to grow up to be a totally thriving, high functioning, maybe even tall and filled out human being, right? Like, these are not indicators of the future of that person, but they feel so important to us in that moment. And again, it's another opportunity for us to feel as though we failed or guilty about something because it's not what we think it should be.
So this is something that someone just said. So how do I stop comparing myself to others?
Well, if there are ways that you can limit your ability to compare, right? You know, if you're following certain sites or people and they're encouraging a comparison in you, it might be a nice idea for like the next week or two to just like not go online or like not expose yourself, even give yourself the opportunity to compare. I really like to encourage women to find platforms, entities where people are telling the truth. We run a very active social media platform, Instagram, and the whole purpose and intent of our Instagram platform is to tell the truth and to talk about the real parts of motherhood. There's also Scary Mommy, which is a platform that I love, and its whole intent and existence is on telling the truth about motherhood. So the more we can surround ourselves and expose ourselves to the realness and the messiness of motherhood, it gives us a little bit less of an opportunity to compare. And the other thing I would say to you is, we can't not compare. We have friends that come over that have babies, right? Like, it's not like we can shut the whole world out. But what we can do is we can remind ourselves of that story that I told, right? And just because somebody looks like they have it all together, they're doing it all right, or it appears to be perfect, we don't know anything about what's really going on for that person. So we cannot take it at its face value.
Absolutely. I always say, try to recognize as the feelings coming up that that's what's happening. Oh, this is the guilt. This is guilt that I'm feeling. And even just labeling it sometimes can take its power away. So, okay, I'm feeling anxiety. I'm making a comparison. And, it's not necessarily going to stop it from happening in that moment, but just the idea of noticing, like, my heart's racing, I'm getting agitated. Oh, I'm comparing, and just acknowledging that it's happening. And then hopefully, like, slowly over time, it doesn't have that same power over you.
Absolutely. Label it, name it. I love it. And give yourself permission to feel it, right? Like, we also don't always have to swoop in and try to change our thoughts or feelings. We're having a feeling for a reason, and every feeling is the right feeling, right? There are no wrong feelings to have because we have them and we're having them and we have them all. So you can also give yourself permission to just be in a comparing space, or feel like I'm falling short. I'm going to let myself be here today because this is where I want to be. And maybe tomorrow I can look at it a little bit differently. But it's also more than okay to give ourselves permission to be where we are.
Yeah, I love that. So I want to make sure if anyone has any final questions that you want to put into the chat. If we can't get to all of these today, there's such good ones and such good examples in here. Thank you, everybody, for showing up and for really sharing some of these questions. If we can't get to all of them, we are going to be sending a wrap-up email with the recording, and we'll try to adjust the main topics that have come up. It looks like a lot of things have come up a bunch, but if this is an opportunity, if you have any final questions, to drop them into the chat. And then sort of meanwhile, Paige, I'm interested, there's a couple things you've said and sort of sprinkled these, really good pearls of wisdom throughout tonight's event. If you were to kind of think of, and put the exact thing you just said to ask our providers, if you can give me two things, if I can't absorb more than two things in my guilt right now, or for our listeners, like, what are like 2 or 3 takeaways from really like this evening's talk about managing this guilt?
So the 3 that I thought about in advance, I did cover 2 of, but I'm going to review them again. First of all, if you are feeling a lot of comparison, if you are feeling a lot of guilt in the way that you're showing up as a pregnant person or as a new mother, and you can identify some of the things that are contributing to that guilt, step away, separate, shut it down. You have every right to limit your exposure to those people, to those platforms, to those things, and surround yourself with ones that are actually making you feel better and normalizing motherhood. If only my teenagers were here right now to help support their mother who is doing a presentation and the dogs are barking in the background. The second one would be to identify a mantra or 2 or 3 that can be a replacement thought in those moments of guilt and shame, or feeling as though we're failing or not doing a good enough job. Again, I'm doing the best I can. Nobody taught me how to do this. Look, people, nobody taught us how to be mothers, right? Like, there is this concept of a maternal instinct, which has scientifically been proven to not exist. And that men and dads and partners have the same maternal instinct that we do as women. So I just want to put that out there. We are not to know how to do this. We are learning this as we would be learning what we need to know in a job for the first time. We are learning as we go along. There is no reason why we should know what we're doing, even if we had younger siblings or we're a child care provider. It's always different when it's happening to us. So coming up with those replacements to should, and again, spray it on your wall, like make it big and visible so that you can access it.
So a mantra is a sentence, and it's not this toxic positivity. It's something real, and
Yes.
it's something that you can either visually see. We said on your phone, on the wall, and then you say it to yourself. I've heard people use mantras and they repeat them. Is it something you have to repeat? Is it something that you can say once?
I think it's something that you want to use when you're in the should moment and the guilt moment. And so, I mean, certainly you can never tell it to yourself enough. It could be on your bathroom mirror so that when you go to the bathroom, you look in the mirror, it's there staring at you. Integrate it as much as you can and make it a part of your everyday life so that it's there, it surrounds you, it protects you, and it tells you the truth. The third thing that I would say is it's okay to not be okay. If you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling hopeless, helpless, if you feel like your mind is a hamster wheel and you're catastrophizing and jumping to conclusions, if it's keeping you up at night, if it's impacting your appetite, these are all real things that happen to new and expecting moms. And it's okay if you need extra help and you need extra support or treatment because your guilt is so profound that you just can't shake it and it's making you feel like a failure all the time or most of the time. That's okay. And that there is treatment out there and there is support out there to help you feel better and get you some relief. So these are the three things that I would hope that people would take away. And if you do find yourself in that category of really not feeling okay and feeling like you need extra help, the Motherhood Center is here for you. We treat women across the tri-state area, and Postpartum Support International is the clearinghouse of anything and everything that has to do with postpartum depression, anxiety, all of those things. And their web address is postpartum.net.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And that will definitely be included in our email after the event. There was one question here that is really right in line with what you were saying is, how do I know if it's going outside of normal? Like, how do I know if this is just a normal postpartum, everybody goes through this guilt, or how do I know if I am in that category of somebody who maybe should seek further support, looking on Postpartum Support International or looking for a therapist or someone else?
It's the number one question. And I always want to be able to say, well, if, this percentage of that and that, unfortunately, it's not that clear cut. What I will say is that everybody has a baseline, and your baseline is where you reside the majority of the time, mentally and emotionally, right? If you find that you are so far from your baseline, if you feel as though these guilty thoughts, this anxious feeling or thoughts, or depressed feelings or thoughts are taking up a lot of space and time throughout the course of the day, if you just can't shake it, if it won't go away, if it's just there most of the time or a significant period of the time, then it's probably worth getting an evaluation and speaking to a mental health specialist who can help you determine whether or not it in fact might be a PMAD. And then most importantly, get you connected to the care that you need to get you feeling better as fast as possible. PMADs are totally treatable. They're like super easy to treat. The hardest part sometimes can be asking for help and coming forward and saying, this is really hard. I'm having a really hard time, and I think I might need some additional support.
I always say nobody regrets just reaching out to somebody, because if everything is fine and after a conversation you're like, actually, I don't think I need more support, then it's not really a big waste of time for you. And if they introduce you to some resources that are helpful, then you don't regret that either. So I think that's really good advice. So we do have to wrap up for tonight. Paige, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was really good to have you. Your insights are invaluable, and I know this is such an important topic.
My pleasure.
Of course, for everyone else who joined us, thank you so much for coming. If you enjoyed this conversation, please head over to sevenstarling.com and check out what we have in terms of memberships and joining us. We guide you every step of the way through pregnancy, postpartum. You join a small group that's handpicked with your gestational age and other important things to you, and you get matched with an expert doula. And they cover everything: symptoms, anxiety, depression, managing, expectations, childbirth ed, newborn care, sleeping, weaning, all this stuff. And what's awesome about it is you can also text your expert anytime to get guidance from them through the app. It is just $37 a month. And for joining us tonight, you can actually use the code SS Events and get 15% off. And of course, you can cancel at any time. Thank you again, Paige. It's been an honor to chat with you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.